Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has just announced an unprecedented move by enacting the Emergency Powers Act, which has not been done before. So here's what he had to say. Take a look at this.
After discussing with Cabinet and caucus, after consultation with premiers from all provinces and territories, after speaking with opposition leaders, the federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act to supplement provincial and territorial capacity to address the blockades and occupations.
We are broadening the scope of Canada's anti-money laundering and terrorist financing rules so that they cover crowdfunding platforms and the payment service providers they use.
And that was the finance minister there, Chrystia Freeland, speaking after Trudeau. And bringing in Billy Hallowell and goins-phillips from CBN's Faith Wire to discuss. Hey, guys.
How's it going?
Hey.
All right. Yeah, so you saw it there. And this is a relatively unprecedented move here for Canada to invoke these emergency powers. And it took, out of all these years, guys, when we look back at the history, they hadn't used it before. And it took all of these things going on over the years. None of it warranted them using it until these truckers came into town. And then they felt it was time to go ahead and use these powers. So this is quite the step.
Yeah, you know, in an era where so many people are not acting themselves and we're seeing all these crazy news stories, I guess some of that craziness is afflicting governments around the world, including the Canadian government. I mean, it's interesting because you would think that the barometer of this would be then having to explain why something they haven't ever used since it was brought into fruition in 1988 would suddenly need to be used, why they wouldn't be able to use the tools before them. Arrests, you know, authorities, police, you know, if you were to behave in a way that, you know, you were acting, you know, let's say you were blocking something with your car, you would be removed. It's perplexing to me why those means that they currently have are not enough, and they would have to go into this other arena. I mean, she mentioned terrorism, right?
Yeah.
And the way that their laws are handled to try to go after the finances. Here's the thing. This is such a slippery slope into anything now that the government doesn't like, right? Any perspective the government has, if an organization has that perspective, it just seems like you're opening a door that would be better left closed.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more, Billy, when it comes to potentially overstepping and going in a direction that, you know, it's hard to close Pandora's box once it's been opened. But I think just an interesting piece of trivia that I've found looking up about the Emergencies Act and even its predecessor. So the bill that was in place prior to this, which came in the 80s, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it was only invoked 3 times during the First and Second World War. And then the interesting piece is that it was invoked a 3rd time, controversially, in 1970 by Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre, who was the prime minister at the time. And he faced a lot of backlash, too, for similar arguments, people saying the federal government was doing something they shouldn't be doing. They were overstepping their bounds. And now I think there's a threat of this happening now, because it seems like this is an outsized response to what has been, at least to my understanding and to everything that I've read over the last several weeks, a very largely peaceful protest. Yes, yeah. Inconvenient. Yes, an occupation, but certainly not violent.
No, and I mean, look, the media has been chomping at the bit to find something to label this violent. I found it very interesting when GoFundMe declined to pass on and allow people to have their donations near $10 million used to help these truckers and to fund, you know, them going to this protest, because they said, well, it's turned violent. And wow. I mean, unless there are a bunch of hidden videotapes out there right now, I have not seen violence. I mean, you know, the nearest protests we can remember, at least here in America, were, you know, a couple summers ago with the Black Lives Matter protests and related protests against police brutality. A lot of those turned violent. Not all, but many of them did. And you didn't see this sort of a reaction from the GoFundMes of the world shutting things down. But So I'm wondering what is the level of violence that is deemed unacceptable to outlets like that. Because I mean, again, maybe there's videotapes going around and things that have happened that I haven't seen, but I would imagine that the media, which, Justin Trudeau himself immediately called this convoy when it was first being reported on a fringe minority. And so, you'd think that it's already, he's giving it negative connotations. You'd think that they would be all over any clip of somebody getting violent or burning a trash can or something. And I've yet to see it go around. Maybe I just missed it.
Well, the other thing here, yes to everything you just said. I think that's all interesting. He framed this in a very particular way at the start of this. And, you can't have it both ways. If something is incredibly dangerous and damaging and terrible, it's either weak or it's terrible. And it seems like they fluctuated between the two. This is just a fringe, weird group. Don't pay attention to the people behind the curtain. And now, here we are. We need the Emergency Powers Act, right, to stop it. But this could also be a political move. If you look at this situation here, the reality is he doesn't just get to say this is happening. It has to go through Parliament and it has to pass. And you have 7 days, I believe, from the time that you announce that you want to invoke this act for Parliament to act on it. And so, he may well know that there's a lot of pushback on this and it's not going to happen. He may be trying to buy himself time. Maybe there's going to be some solution that's sought in the middle of this. I don't know. This is all, speculation, but you start to look at the premiers and what they're saying. And most of what I'm seeing outside of Ontario, outside of Doug Ford, is that people are, the leaders are saying, we don't want this. And if you're going to invoke it, don't invoke it in our province. It's not something we need. We have the situation under control. So that's an interesting dynamic that leads me to believe, you saw him there saying, I've consulted with everybody. Well, if you heard them, then why aren't you listening to them unless there's maybe something else going on here?
You can't discount the political frustration there, like you were alluding to, Billy, which is, I think, he's seen so many protesters who are angry over government edicts and mandates that he's put in place. So there's probably a level of, well, I'm just going to double down even more on this position and potentially try to invoke this Emergencies Act. But like you were saying, there are several people, lawmakers in Canada who are opposed to it. Jason Kenney, he's the premier of Alberta. He said that he believes that it will just inflame the protesters and make the situation potentially worse because, like I said, these people are protesting government mandates. The strong arm of the government is what they're protesting. So an even stronger arm of the government is probably not going to go over well, politically speaking. Now, of course, the government has to, control and keep things at peace. But again, this doesn't seem like it's been a violent protest.
Mm-mm.
Can I add one more thing there, Dan? So
yeah, go ahead.
The Canadian Civil Liberties Association, they came out almost immediately saying that this was a major concern, that if you look at this, it does not meet the high and clear threshold that it needs to meet in order to be enacted, and that this is actually dangerous to normalize the use of this act. And so, again, it's not just lawmakers, it's people who are looking at civil liberties in Canada who are very concerned about this, which, again, it makes me think maybe there's a strategy behind this and he knows it's not going to go through and it's not going to pass.
Well, and it's interesting because when you look at what's happening, and now, of course, the bridge, when they were blocking the bridge and the police did come in and clear that out. And I think when you take part in a protest, you understand, okay, if I'm blocking a road here, I'm giving them grounds to give me a traffic ticket and a citation and tow my truck out of here. So, but that's what you do in a protest in order to get attention so that the cameras are on you to highlight your issue. You have to, stir things up and get authorities out there. When people are when they're trying to do that is essentially what I'm saying. I'm not advocating that. But it's interesting because when people do that, when they protest it, and the argument here from Trudeau essentially is, well, you guys are shutting down the economy here. You're stopping people's ability to work. And that's sort of almost exactly what these protesters are protesting against the government doing. They're putting these things on the truckers. Over the last 2 years, the Canadian government has imposed, incredible restrictions that stop people from doing their jobs. So it seems okay when the government decides to say, well, it's in our best interest to do this. But when the people rise up and say, hey, we need to shut things down so that you can, see what's going on here and let us have our lives back. that's unacceptable. And that's what Trudeau called it, was quote unquote unacceptable views.
Yeah. Well, and there were concerns that this was going to make people dig in their heels more. And we're already seeing that. There's a report of one trucker who quit his job, actually, and returned right back to the protest. And this one individual said, the more they are trying to put us in the corner, the more we are willing to stand our ground. That is going to be a sentiment that you're going to see play out here, because now, and this is why there were premiers warning about this, that once you do this, it's going to embolden people. If you're willing to park your truck somewhere for a week, chances are you're willing to go pretty far in terms of how devoted you are because you believe in this. And I would just add that their complaints, we're actually seeing some of the provinces roll back some of their regulations because of this. So it has been effective in some ways. But the complaints about the vaccine mandate, the vaccine itself is not doing, it's wonderful. I'm not anti-vax. I am boosted and vaccinated, and it's done a great, I'm just putting that out there. It's done a great deal of good for people, but the reality is it's not preventing the spread. And so why are these mandates remaining when it's not actually doing what was promised it would do? And that's part of this. It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and to your point, Dan, about the bridge, Ambassador Bridge in Ontario, it was cleared out at the beginning of this week. So they wouldn't be using the Emergencies Act to clear that bridge. And also the issue in Alberta initially was they were blocking the travel between the United States and Canada. The protesters actually negotiated ultimately with the police and opened up a lane of traffic so that emergency vehicles, law enforcement, whoever, could get to and from the United States to Canada and vice versa. So there has already been a lot of negotiation and work being done, which I think is probably, to your point, Billy, why so many premiers are saying, if you're going to invoke this, don't invoke it here in our province, because we're dealing with it. We're handling and getting what we need to get done. So it does lead me to think that this is possibly, like you were saying, Billy, more of a political move than an actual on the ground strategic move.
Yeah. And I would just say too, I think for all the, let's just pray that all these truckers and whoever's protesting remain peaceful, because, it seems now that Trudeau has sort of backed himself into this corner. Instead of just, speaking with them and seeing what they could come up with, maybe get some compromise on some things, he's just kind of doubled down on this language of essentially, as you heard in the clips there, talk illegal, barricade, unacceptable views, fringe minority. And then with the financial, secretary there talking about, expanding the Terrorist Powers Act where they can seize finances and things. So you have all of these just negative associations going on. He sort of backed himself into this corner where almost they're probably hoping for something to come up so that they can justify all of these actions. And to my point here, guys, I was just looking at this sentiment. When you look at the most recent protests we can remember, as I mentioned before, the Black Lives Matter, anti-police type protests that were going on, you look at Amnesty International here. Here's their statement on the Freedom Convoy, and I realize that print's a little small, so I'll try to read some of it here. But they said they're following with great concern the developments relating to the Freedom Convoy blockade in Ottawa. They said they're deeply troubled by the reports of violence, harassment, intimidation, hate speech, which have surfaced since January 29th. They cite Nazi flags, Confederate flags, and other symbols of racism and hate exhibited have no room in peaceful protests. Equally concerning is the affiliation of some convoy organizers with overtly racist white supremacist groups. So that's what their statement is on that, and they go on and on about that. Now, listen, so I look back at what did they say about the Black Lives Matter protests, and they go on and on here, but they talk about the police side of it. And so now all of a sudden it's police forces across the United States have committed widespread and egregious human rights violations in response to largely peaceful assemblies protesting systemic racism and police violence. So it's interesting to look at the dynamic there of those two things. And that's just Amnesty International, but I've seen similar sort of framing from different outlets, but that one kind of sums it up very well. The difference there, and it's really stunning to see because, again, not all the Black Lives Matter protests were violent, but there was a lot of rioting going on. We saw stores being looted, buildings burning. You had actual incidents of violence happening. And And again, I'll qualify this. I mean, I saw plenty of Black Lives Matter protesters yelling at these anarchists and everything else. So just forget all the dynamics about it. Point is, there were these protests that actually did get violent. This one has not yet got violent, but look at the framing. The framing is all trying to get you worked up about it, that this is the next January 6th here in Canada.
Yeah, and that's the part of this. I think the fact that it hasn't been covered, equally, and it never really is. Now, having said that, is it appropriate to set up trucks and block a bridge? No, at some point, no. Like, you can't. It affects the entire community. There are real effects that need to be dealt with. Now, am I saying that they don't have the right to do it? No, I'm just saying there's a consequence to any protest, as you were saying, right? We know there's going to be a consequence to it. They know it. Every protester knows that. But I think, to your point, that the media bias and how these things are covered, it's implicit, it is massive, and yet people continue to deny it. And I think we all have to be consistent. It doesn't matter whether you're a liberal or a conservative. When you see things and they're illegal or they're problematic, being able to talk through that and understand that and point it out. And, listen, Trudeau, he took a knee. He went out to the protest, which is his right. That's fine. It's very interesting how people frame different protesters based on their ideology. We see that play out. I was curious, and I went and looked to see, how did he react to BLM? And he had a very specific, supportive reaction to it. And I think, honestly, when you're a leader and you're leading an entire populace, there are going to be lots of different ideas there. So for your first statement to be one of dismissal, mocking people, making them seem like some fringe, minority group, that is not the way to approach this. Almost every step of the way, I think he's made the problem worse. This seems to be, the crescendo of making the situation worse. So I don't know where it goes from here.
Yeah, I think too, it's interesting to see the way the media has reported on this and portrayed it, both in the United States and from outlets in Canada, because when it's a politically advantageous protest, we see a lot of reporting on the point of the protest. With Black Lives Matter, it was police reform, racial inequality or perceived racial inequity, whatever. So those were the headlines that were made, and then it was largely peaceful, that kind of dismissed or qualified any sort of fringe violence that might have occurred. But then when it comes to this, the stories, and I think this is telling, the stories are about the interruption. It's about this protest is just an interruption, and here's how all of these people's lives have been interrupted and inconvenienced. And it's like the point is just completely missing, or
Right.
Journalists, I should say, are completely missing the point of the protest. Whereas when it's the other way around, it's just that's the media bias factoring in. When it's the other way around, they'll go out of their way to make sure the point is acknowledged. So I think that's some of the frustration here too, is just an unwillingness to acknowledge the point of the protest.
And then when they do acknowledge the point, they get it wrong. I saw the Associated Press refer to this just in a write-up about the protest as an anti-vaccine protest. And that's just very clearly not what it is. I don't think there's anyone saying that. I mean, there's thousands of people there. Maybe there's a couple, but the organizers and the overwhelming point of the whole thing are the mandates. And that's what they're frustrated about. And so it's tough to fight that kind of thing, because that's the Associated Press. The Associated Press goes out and it's repeated. Whatever they put out there gets republished and repeated, hundreds, thousands of times. And then that narrative gets out there.
Sorry, I was just going to say, to your point, Dan, the vast majority, as Justin Trudeau has repeatedly said, the vast majority of truckers in Canada are vaccinated. So this is not an anti-vaccine protest.
Right.
But that's the thing, and that's what you were speaking to, Trey. And we've seen this because we cover a lot of stories over the years. When something like BLM happens, I think journalists should do this. They do these wonderful explainers. Why do people believe what they believe? Why are they out there protesting? What does it mean to them? When the truckers do it, they're anti-vaccine, protest. There's no explanation. There's no real understanding. And I don't want to generalize. There are some reporters who have done it, but on the whole, that is the treatment these sorts of things get. And of course, people are confused because they don't have any framing of why in the world those people are out there trying to make their voices heard.
Yeah. And I, like you said, Billy, I would second that. There are a lot of good individual reporters, even at places like CNN. I know that'll surprise some people, but that do a really good job on many issues. But that's not what we're talking about. When and at least me, I'll speak for myself. When I refer to the media, I'm talking about the general drumbeat the typical headline that you see getting repeated over and over and over again. Yeah, you can always search it up and find a point here and there, but when the general tone of something is being repeated over and over, that's what most people are going to see. So yeah, there might be, and people, I see people do that. Oh, see, CNN did report on this, and you said they didn't. Well, if you watch the show or you watch CNN, and then you look at their site, like the overwhelming majority of the time spent will be on, you know, the egregious talking point or whatever the one they're complaining about is. So yeah, people do cover it, but it's that drumbeat, it's the incessant sort of repeating of said point is what at least I'm referring to.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah. Well, and I was going to say Fox News, for instance, right? When you'll have a lot of people on the left complain that people who watch Fox News only see things from one way. But the irony of that, and people can believe whatever they want on that front, is that the people who are watching the other outlets, they don't see, and there's some of the same people, that the same effect happens to them when they have not been exposed to maybe what Fox is saying or what some other alternative media outlet is saying. You know, we are a product when it comes to what we consume. We're a product of that consumption in a lot of ways in what we believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I was just going to add. That's why it's so important to have a good media diet, or whether you're, you know, Christian, conservative, progressive, liberal, whatever. It's good to know what the other side is thinking. It's good to get a broad spectrum of, or to take in a broad spectrum of information and actually get content from people who are on the ground. Who are in the situation, who are doing their best to portray the reality of what's happening on the ground. Because the reality is that there's biases everywhere, and nobody's going to be completely objective. We're fallen, sinful people, as we know as believers, so we can't weed out all of our biases. But you know, I think it certainly is good to seek out those journalists that you and Billy, you and Dan were saying. There are journalists doing good work, so seek those people out and follow the content they're putting out.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of them are right here at CBN News and Faithwire, so you can always just start right here. I mean, this should be your starting point, and then you can balance it out elsewhere. But you know, we always start right here first. I think it's just a good little bit of advice here from yours truly. So, all right, guys, thanks for joining us.